Hey guys, Metal Jesus here, and today we're going to be taking a look at some DLC for the excellent Atari 50, the Anniversary Celebration. Now, if you're not familiar with the Atari 50, it blew us fans away when this was released a couple years ago because it was a really cool mix of Atari history, along with original promotional material, marketing material, game manuals, and of course you could play games. And they had over 100 games pulled from the arcades, from their home computers, their home consoles, the handhelds. It was quite a thing. And so now Atari and Digital Eclipse are back with some new DLC. And yeah, this is going to be pretty cool. They've added 19 playable games. There are 8 brand new video interviews, and it all integrates into a brand new timeline into the main game. The developers gave me a review code, and I've gone through the entire thing, and so I'm going to give you some of my highlights. The first section that really stood out to me is the art of Atari, specifically the creation of that iconic logo that we all know and love, but it also includes in there some really interesting options that they considered at the time. These would be other logos that they could have ended up using, but thankfully didn't. In there, it's also fascinating to hear about why they went from the name Atari VCS to Atari 2600. I've always wondered about that because for me as a kid growing up, I always knew it as the 2600, but then you hear so many people today also refer to it as the VCS. They also go into detail talking about changing the packaging at the time to better stand out on some of these crowded store shelves, specifically when they were sitting next to the Odyssey, the ColecoVision, the Intellivision, and many of the others. So again, a real cool kind of insight into what Atari and specifically their marketing department was thinking about at the time.
It was clear that the Atari, branding big was the way to go. It's like, hello, why didn't we think of that sooner?
There's a section here where they cover how it was really the fans of Atari and also the homebrew community that really kept the name alive for decades, specifically calling out to Albert and his Atari Age website. And it's this third-party website that he really built into this repository for everything that is Atari, including a list of every single game that was released, their box art, their manuals. And then he talks about how he brought homebrew games to the website and how you could buy them there. Again, at a time when Atari, the company, was pretty much ignoring anything from the past. Yet here is this website where you could buy brand new Atari games for all these old systems. And then the last piece to that is the really popular forums on Atari Age that are incredibly active. There's pretty much every type of topic you could possibly think of there, including a section there dedicated to learning how to program on these old, systems, these old Atari computers. So that was a really fascinating part of this DLC for sure.
Atari really wasn't paying attention to this growing community of people who are basically celebrating the brand.
I don't think there was any time during those years when homebrew really started to take off for the Atari consoles that Atari at that time felt in any way threatened.
I don't think they knew we existed.
They also talk about the effect other home consoles had on Atari in the 80s and some of the decisions they made to continue support the 2600 during that time. I think it was surprising for a lot of people, myself included as a kid, because you would see new 2600 games. This is during the NES era, right? And Atari still pumped out new games for that, although they did change the packaging during that time to help it stand out in the crowded consumer market. There's a section in the DLC where they talk in detail about vector graphics, specifically in arcades. That was very important to Atari at the time. And so you get to hear why programmers and designers loved using vector graphics at the time, but also some of the programming challenges. So that was pretty interesting. And like I mentioned, this collection is pretty neat because not only do you get insight into the history and making of the games, but you also get to play most of them as well. So this collection is pretty cool because it has 19 games that you can jump into. And here are some of the highlights. The first one is a game that I think a lot of people are excited to have in this, and that is Berzerk. I was actually surprised that this wasn't included in the original release. And so, a lot of people asked for this, myself included. And now we get the original arcade version of this classic shooter. Plus, you get the excellent 2600 port, which, by the way, I played this to death as a kid. This was one of my favorite cartridges growing up. You also get the Atari 5200 version, which is pretty weird. You can tell that the 5200 had that kind of floppy analog controller, and so it's translated into a modern controller here. It's completely playable, but trust me, when you try it, you'll notice the difference. And then they also added the 2600 voice enhanced version, which was a homebrew. And there's also a little video about the making of that.
And so in order to get speech to even sound similar to that chip, you have to apply all of Atari 2600's resources to it. So in order to get the sample to play back fast enough, you have to do things like don't display the screen. So the screen goes black so you can get a cleaner and more audible sound out of the processor, the sound processor.
And then to wrap it up, there's the often forgotten sequel, which is Frenzy. Here's a curious game I was not familiar with until I actually played around with this, and that is Atari Video Cube. So this game started out as a Rubik's Cube game, and you can totally see that when you play this, but they had to change the name, probably due to licensing issues. But originally this game actually was only available to Atari Club members. Is it a good game? I don't know. It's a weird take on Rubik's Cube, but it's kind of neat. I mentioned those late release 2600 games that came in those red boxes, that were different from some of the earlier releases. There's a bunch of them included on this, including Off the Wall. So this is a game I was not familiar with, but it plays very similar to Breakout. However, they've added power-ups, and so this feels very similar to Arkanoid, as well as Desert Falcon. So this is a game that I'm very familiar with. I actually have a copy in my collection, and this is a game that's often overlooked, but it's pretty cool. It's a shooter, and it plays very similar to Zaxxon. It's technically kind of like an isometric view shooter, although, on the 2600, it doesn't really look like much. It's really, it's looking as good as it possibly can here. However, this is surprisingly fun. It's got it where it counts, and that's the gameplay. Here's another game that I was not familiar with. It's called Avalanche, and it's an arcade game that only got an Atari 8-bit home computer port, and it was the inspiration for Activision's Kaboom. You can totally see that here. I was amazed to see this, but it's just different enough. It actually starts off slower, and you have way more stacks to absorb what's falling down. I guess that's how you would describe that. But yeah, this is pretty interesting to see. I love seeing all this history included in here. Destroyer is another game that looks very dated, and it is, but honestly, it's pretty fun. So you have a destroyer ship at the top that goes back and forth automatically. And then what you do here is you drop these charges, and you see that line there? You can set the depth at which they explode. So you're hoping to time your attacks as the enemy goes by. This game looks simple, and it is. It's really easy to pick up and play and kind of figure out, but it's surprisingly fun. I actually played this game probably the most on this entire collection. They included a vector game here called Red Baron, and I remember seeing this as a kid and being kind of blown away by it. Kind of similar to Battlezone, really. It's hard to imagine today, but back then, this is how you were able to do real-time 3D graphics in the arcade. This was top of the line, people, and it's a pretty fun game. It's basically just kind of like a first-person shooter, really, and it's not too complex. You can jump in and have a good time. Not too complicated. And so, like I said, there's 19 games in total included with this, and so I've just kind of shown you some of the highlights here. Obviously, there's more games to jump into and mess around with if you decide to pick this up. Now, the cool thing is, this is only the first DLC that they're going to release, but they actually have another one planned in November. And that's going to be titled The First Console War. And essentially what they're going to do is another physical release of the Atari 50. They're going to call it the Expanded Edition, and it's going to come out for the Nintendo Switch and the PlayStation 5 for $40. And that physical version will contain the original game and both DLCs. And so there's a lot of Atari stuff coming, both old and new, and it was really fun to jump back into this. I was very happy to do it. You know, I'm a big Atari fan. I've been an Atari fan my entire life, so this was really cool to see. I'll put links in the video description below if you want to check out more information. And as always, guys, I want to thank you for watching my channel. Thank you for subscribing, and take care.